Welcome everyone to lecture 2 of the course Market Institutions. Today we're going to talk about positives or the descriptive side of economics as opposed to normatives or the prescriptive or value judgment sort of part of economics, which we will discuss in the next class. So we want to discuss a few different sort of concepts today. Primarily we'll talk about self-interest and rationality and what that means. So let's start by thinking about what rationality means. It means that we utilize the full information that might be available to us, that choices are made independently, that individuals who are being studied have stable preferences, and they use these assumptions to argue that we can compute the decisions that we as economic agents can compute the decisions that we have to take to logical perfection. In other words, if we're assuming that we have clear objectives and take the precisely correct actions to achieve those objectives. This makes for consistent logical models, and as we'll explain in a bit, will sort of allow us to predict how the economy usually behaves. And the immediate consequence of assuming rationality is more often than not, and in most contexts, the idea of profit maximization. That is, that individuals are attempting to maximize profits, where profits and how those are defined we'll come to in a bit. People will often think when we say profit maximization, people will often think that we're arguing for a very mechanically and unrealistically calculating type of human. This isn't really the case. In fact, human babies are rational too. So if you look at various experiments that have been done on the behavior of human babies, we find that at a very early age they can distinguish rare versus common events. They can use correlations to learn causation at least as early as 3 months of age. They can distinguish inert objects from intentional agents, that is, objects from individuals and animals by the 4th month of their existence, and can categorize information and even allocate attention within 30 minutes of being born, actually. And there's a fascinating literature that explains the type of experiments that have been done to understand human baby psychology. And so all of this together suggests that human babies have clear objectives. That is, for example, if the objective is to get their pamper changed, they take the correct actions to achieve that objective, which is to cry. If they're hungry, they take the correct action, which is to cry. If they want to be held, or burped, they take the correct action, which is to cry. And so they are able to learn these things after being born because of their inherent rationality. But we don't have to stop at humans. If you think about animals, animals also have been shown. So evolutionary biology is sort of predicated on the theory that living beings consistently or living things consistently work on self-preservation, whether that is preservation of the individual self or the preservation of the gene pool of your being. You take actions and you evolve in a manner that preserves these things. And so this, of course, is not just a theory, it's been supported by mountains of evidence. So often the criticism of rationality is that it doesn't really seem to be in line with how we know humans to behave. It doesn't sit well with a self-reflected analysis, if you will, of how humans behave. And economists understand this. I often find that students in first or second year classes will often complain that economics seems to be founded on very unrealistic assumptions. This is not true. The rationality model is is a core model that has use, but that we understand is unrealistic. Why we continue to use an unrealistic model, I'll come to in a bit. But please understand that the rational human, as defined by economists, is not understood by economists to be a description of reality. Instead, it is a simplification that allows us to get some value out of it. The example that I like to give my students when I'm trying to explain this is to think about medical college. Imagine that you were a first year medical college student, and your professor walks in and wants to explain how the heart functions. And they put before you a plastic model of the heart. And they say, this is the heart. And then they open it up, and inside you can see the different walls and cavities within the heart. What if you turned around and said, let's take a sample and send it to the lab so that we can understand the chemistry of the heart? Well, your professor would say, that's absurd because all you'll find is plastic. And then you turn around and say, well, this is a really unrealistic model. We know hearts are not made of plastic. Why are you teaching us this? And the answer is that we teach you simplified models, whether it is in biology or in economics, because by paring away some of the complexities of reality, we're able to get you to focus in on what it is that we're trying to explain to you. When economists say that humans are self-interested, rational human beings or economic agents, that is not to say that we believe that humans are like this. And economists have studied the complexities of human behavior much more. But we say it because we want to start with a simplified model, and then we add the complexity later. So if you were to talk about that sort of complexity, when we said that humans, the rational agent will use all information available, we are not taking into account the fact that there are costs in searching for information, and that there is a cognitive burden or a cognitive load that the economic agent has to bear in order to absorb and to use that information. Economists have, in the last 5 decades or so, really engaged with these type of problems and have developed models to account for them. But again, this is not the sort of thing that is easy to integrate into a simplified understanding of the economy, and so we leave it for later discussion. And we'll talk about some of these things later in the course. Similarly, when we say choices are made independently, we're not paying attention to the idea of herd behavior, that is, moving with the crowd, or of information cascades, which is even sort of beyond the scope of this course to even begin to explain. But the point is that, again, economists understand that we don't always make our choices independently, that there are trends and there are sort of crowd behavior, and there is that study when you advance in your understanding of economics. We also assume stable preferences, and in fact, economists have spent a lot of time studying instability of preferences. For example, with addictions, you start off taking a substance that has addictive properties, and over time, the more you take, the more it is that you want to demand this. But then if you get a break from the addictive, you might not have that preference down the line. You might prefer other things more. That sort of variation is naturally going to have to be accommodated. Economists have worked on this. We said that the rational economic agent computes decisions to logical perfection. And here I think it's important to keep in mind other regarding preferences. So economists have studied in significant depth the idea of things like love and jealousy, things where the others and other economic agents' utility is of interest to the self. And as again, this connects back to some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, but your ability to compute decision and to make decisions is also finite. So we can suffer analysis paralysis. If you've been in a store where you've had 20 different options of what to buy, say a shoe shop, and you've liked multiple options, you might get stuck, even though if we took away half of them, you'd be able to make a better decision, because you have a greater cognitive burden where you're trying to make multiple comparisons. Similarly, humans have finite willpower. There are some great studies about willpower that you can read, which suggest that willpower is like a muscle, where the more you use it over time, the more it grows. But if you're using it at a given time, you have less of it left to use in a short time span. Similarly to a muscle, where if you're in the gym and you're working out consistently over time, that muscle will grow. But if you've used it quite heavily today, it will have tired. What choices you make, if they depend on that sort of willpower, then that seems to go against the idea of stable preferences. So behavioral economics has studied many other things also, such as loss aversion and the idea of anchoring, which I'll skip over today, but you should absolutely read up on your own. They're very interesting traits that will be very, you'll be able to relate to these type of traits. But because these have been discovered and well explored over the last 30-40 years, economists have had to engage with that. So why is it that we are interested in rationality? What is the use that economists derive from rationality if it is such an oversimplified description of reality? Well, we use it because, keep in mind that until about 10 years ago, in the history of humankind, we didn't have the computational power to apply very complex models of how people behave to different contexts. And we didn't have enough data coming into our computational systems that allowed for that sort of model to be applied. Even today, it's much easier to make the assumption that people respond to incentives in a consistent manner and to use it to develop these models that we'll talk about in this class, than to predict human behavior through other means. When I started teaching intermediate microeconomics about 10 years ago, I used to say, sometime in our lifetimes, maybe in 20-25 years, we'll be able to integrate a better model of human behavior and that will be able to compute how people will react in different contexts. And reality has exceeded expectation in the sense that with the advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning, humans are much better able to predict other humans' behavior today than they have been perhaps at any time in history. If you look at your Netflix recommendation queue, or if you look at what Amazon suggests you buy, for example, all of these large technological companies are using these artificial intelligence models to predict how you will behave. These models are still simple enough that they can only be applied in certain contexts, especially ones that have what is called big data, or a very, very large sum of data, so that they can look for consistencies and correlations. So if I've been watching program X, it will go and look at what the 50,000 other people who've watched program X like to watch, and typically they will like to watch the same sort of programs that I like to watch. And so based on those sort of correlations, Netflix will recommend what I should watch next. It can't yet tell me what to eat for lunch, but that might also be something that it can develop further on. It probably can't tell for a few years how angry I'm likely to get today. And these are the type of things that I at least expect will become a reality perhaps in the next, let's say, 20 years. And if that's the case, perhaps we can move on from rationality as the basis of how we describe the economy, or what the underlying engine of our predictions and our explanations of the economy are. When we say people respond to incentives, and especially, I think it's a reasonable claim to make to say that people respond to incentives predictably. I'll give you a few examples. So consider different markets. Consider the labor market, for example, or the capital market, or the product market. Those are three of the most important types of markets in economic activity, although there are very many others. And let's think about prices going up. So for example, in the Pakistani car industry, in the last 1.5-2 years, prices have shot up sort of substantially. So many cars now cost maybe 40% more than they did only a short 18 months or 2 years ago. Well, when those prices go up, we expect that the quantity demanded will decrease because people will shift their expenditures away to other things if they can. Another example is that in the year 2001, when I joined LUMS as an undergraduate, and before that in the year 2000 or so, we saw a sudden, computer science used to be one of the most well-subscribed majors. And at that time, there was a sudden shift away from computer science towards economics. Why do you think that might have happened? Well, the dot-com bubble had burst. The dot-com bubble was, as with any speculative bubble, the overbuying of technology stocks and the overinvestment into technology between around 1995 and the year 2000, or the year 1999. In this span, the NASDAQ, which is the American stock market for technology companies, grew in value to about 4 times its size in the span of those 5 years, and then plummeted to below what it was at the start. So that relationship looks like this. And so when it became apparent that the technology industry was not going to have very many jobs again, well, lo and behold, the labor market responded, and LUM students started switching from a computer science major to an economics major. So what does this have to do with rationality, and how can we integrate this idea of rationality into a broader concept of how the economy works? In his classic book, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argued that every individual neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. Individuals don't care about the public interest. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which has no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So what Smith is saying here is really that you don't need individuals to care about trying to grow the economy. They just need to care about trying to grow their own shop. They don't need to try to develop Pakistan. They need to think about how to develop their own farm. And by doing this, if enough people are only in the pursuit of their own personal commercial interest are working, they'll be able to create more overall. And the argument is that because people respond to incentives, there is going to be an aggregation in the system where behaviors aggregate to more. And this perhaps will become more apparent when we talk about the demand and supply curves, perhaps in the next class. But this idea, I think Smith was perhaps overstating things. In the approximately 250 years since Smith wrote this, economists have come to understand that there are important scenarios in which individuals pursuing self-interest is not enough to get the correct behavior for the overall health of the economy. However, I think many times commentators overstate the importance of market failures that we need to worry about, and it's important to keep in mind the original wisdom of Smith's words, that left to their own devices, individual players in the market and the players in the economy can do quite a lot. And we'll come back and talk more about this again in the next class. What are the big questions about the economy? So one is, what is produced? Another is, how much is produced? Then for whom is it produced? And finally, how do we make decisions about businesses in the economy? How do we decide what firms should stick around and what should go bankrupt? How do we decide what sectors of the economy will grow or not? We can decide this as individuals. So I can decide whether I want to remain a professor or not, and that's my little bit in the economy. We can decide as managers of firms. So we can decide about, I might have a seat at the table of how lumps functions, where I'm making a decision not on expenditures of money that come out of my pocket, but out of the organization's pocket. And finally, we can make decisions politically. And if you look at any politician's arguments about the economy, you'll often find this idea that we should support X or Y. So in this case, the People's Party politician Nafisa Shah, who's an Oxford PhD actually in sociology or something, is arguing that the government, by not investing more in supporting PIA, is actually doing a bad thing. Now, when you have more competition coming in from other airlines, well, competition will mean that prices for consumers will be driven down. So what she's effectively saying here is that it's more important to preserve PIA than to ensure that Pakistanis get cheap airline tickets. And this is ultimately a political decision. In another context, if there's a private firm, the government would not be intervening in whether that firm exists or not. It would continue to work or not based on its economic needs or its economic logic. And so throughout this course, when we're talking about the economy, it's important to keep in mind the idea, and especially when you're reading newspapers about the economy, keep in mind there are a lot of times, especially in Pakistan, a lot of decisions about what firms will exist and what rules will govern economic activity are not being made by individual firms or individual players in the market aggregating in a wholesome way, but politically, by interests vying with one another to create rules that support them. And we'll try and speak about these from time to time as we go through the course. So that's that for today. And in the next class, we will be talking more about how to judge different scenarios that might arise. Thank you.